All right, now it's time for our next step in preparing for and understanding COVID. This is an accumulation of much research on my part, using the research that a lot of other much smarter people have done, putting it all together for you. So today we're going to look at two related issues around COVID. Firstly, virology, what the virus is, how it works, and secondly, health. What's it doing in our bodies? How do we respond? How can we respond? What should we do? I can't stress enough that this is life and death stuff. These days, you really need to know this. I don't need you to know like memorize numbers and stuff like that, but I do need you to know this information. It'll be on the test, and you absolutely need to understand it and remember it and learn it. So to begin with the virology, uh, let me give you just an overview first on viruses. Remember, I spoke to you about viruses in general before with the PowerPoint, and viruses insert themselves into our DNA. Uh, they're called retroviruses. Uh, Coronavirus is not one of those, but there are viruses that do that. And usually, when they insert themselves into our DNA, they become inactive. We are 8% viral. It's become a political issue lately in the US about Neanderthals, but I'm 4% Neanderthal because I'm not from sub Saharan Africa. All of us are about 4%, some 2%, some 5, but about 4% Neanderthal. And all of us humans are 8% virus. Viruses have inserted themselves into our DNA. And most of our DNA does not actually code for anything, does not code for proteins or anything. And that's true of most of this viral DNA. It's just part of our DNA does nothing. But viruses are not all bad. One of the exceptions is when you are a baby inside your mama, your tissue merges with, as a fetus, the fetal tissue, merges with your mother's tissue so that you can get oxygen and nutrients and give her waste and carbon dioxide. Yes, a lot of that amniotic fluid is you peeing inside your mom. And that pee and that poop needs to go somewhere. It goes into her blood. But how does it get from you into your mother's system when they are somewhat separated? You are a different person than your mother. Well, that is because of viruses. That ability to merge fetal cells comes from viral DNA that was inserted in us and before our humans were around into all mammals a long time ago. How did that work? We're going to get into that. But I just want to point out that as much as we really hate the coronavirus, viruses are not all bad. So, what is happening in the virology? Virology is the study of viruses. When we look at the virus from the virus's perspective, it just wants to make copies of itself. It wants to reproduce like all species do. What is happening with that virus? Some terminology first. COVID 19 is a type uh, of coronavirus disease that came and started in 2019. Technically, it looks like it started in China in around November of 2018, but we didn't know about it until 2019, so its name is COVID 19. That's the disease. The group of viruses called COVID include the cold. Now, COVID is a group of different viruses, including colds, that cause uh, that are a kind of disease. So, COVID 19 is the disease, and the group of diseases is COVID, including the cold. There are many COVID diseases. COVID 19 is one particular one. SARS CoV 2 capital S, capital A, capital R, capital S dash, capital C, small o, capital V dash 2 is the specific virus in question. It is similar to the SARS virus of about a decade ago, part of that SARS family. A coronavirus is the group of viruses that can cause these problems. SARS-CoV-2 is one specific coronavirus that we deal with now. Colds are a type of coronavirus that attach to the upper surface of the respiratory tract where we breathe. They're not so bad. We don't like them, but they've been around for a very long time. We deal with it. We have used some shorthands over the past year. We say COVID as capital C, lowercase OVID, because we got tired of capitalizing the whole thing, capital C, OVID, all caps, although the latter is technically the way to do it. We say coronavirus as the thing that's attacking us with COVID-19, when technically it's SARS-CoV-2. I'll keep on referring to it as just COVID and coronavirus for the rest of this video, but just to be clear, that is a shorthand. They're actually, colds are a coronavirus. COVID is a large group of viral diseases, and COVID-19 is one specific disease that comes from a virus called SARS-CoV-2. Coronavirus is a virus. COVID is the disease. Let's look at the virus. As we discussed when we were looking at virology last week, it is covered with an envelope, a capsid protein. You can see this in your book. Now, the good news is when we're dealing with SARS-CoV-2, the coronavirus in particular, they are less hardy and they're more vulnerable to heat, humidity, and ultraviolet light. The bad news is they have lots of spikes on them, and these spikes mean the virus doesn't have to have direct contact with these dangerous, humid, hot, ultraviolet surfaces. Dangerous from the perspective of the virus. What does it do? What happens? The new coronavirus, novel coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, latches its spiky surface proteins to receptors on healthy cells in our bodies, especially those in your lungs. All viruses have an affinity to certain proteins on a cell, and it depends on which proteins and which virus. Different viruses have an affinity. They like different proteins on the surface of our cells that make up our body. Now, specifically what's happening, the viral proteins are going to bust into the cells through an ACE, capital ACE2 protein receptor. It has the key and it opens the door to the cell through that protein, letting itself in. What happens next is one of two possibilities when we're dealing with SARS-CoV-2, the novel coronavirus. The greasy envelope of the virus combines with the greasy envelope of our cells, and they kind of just merge together. Or it triggers the cell to envelop it like the blob that we saw in that short movie, that short video, and surround it. So here is the virus, my head, and the cell is triggered. The cell is forced to envelop it and take it away into the cell. Once inside, the coronavirus hijacks a healthy cell and takes command, like we discussed previously. Eventually, it kills some of the healthy cells. An RNA virus is what we find in most viruses that infect mammals, and including the coronaviruses. It's inside the cell, and now it's going to burst from its bubble, letting the genes free. The viral genes make copies of the virus, as we discussed. And you use the cell's proteins to make the genes for more viruses. How does this happen? They make copies of the gene. The virus had genes inside of it when it was inside a protein sheath, like I showed you in the PowerPoint. It enters the cell and it leaves behind that protein sheath. And now it's just free DNA, or in this case, free RNA, ribonucleic acid, that can make copies of itself. It makes short copies of parts of the gene to make the proteins for a new protein coat. And it makes copies of the total gene to make the important part of the virus. Again, are viruses alive or not? They can't reproduce without living cells, but then again, maybe they're just better at reproducing and more efficient. They just sit there inert, waiting until they find a cell that they can make copies of. It makes the mRNA that the cell makes, a kind of RNA called messenger RNA. It makes that mRNA stop functioning for cell purposes. And this is a twofer. That means it'll continue to function to make viral proteins, to make more of the virus. And more virus will be made, but the cell can't respond to the attacking virus. It's smart. Now, the cell produces an immune response. Your body produces an immune response. Antibodies are going to be produced by our bodies to paint the cell, the virus, as I previously discussed. So your white blood cells can engulf. But also, in the case of coronavirus, they will block the attachment of the virus to cells, the points where the virus would attach. The cells also produce interferons, interferon. And interferons are produced inside the cell to stop viral reproduction. When they're released from the cell, they tell the body, hey, there's an attack going on. Come to the rescue, white blood cells. But COVID, yay, it stops the interferons from working. Now the virus moves down the respiratory tract, and this is where it's bad, because remember, colds are a type of coronavirus, but they're up here. The virus moves down into the lungs, in the lower respiratory tract. Goes deeper than a cold virus. And that's where there's more ACE2 receptors, which is what the novel coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, uses to attach. If a doctor does a CT scan, it will show these areas that look like ground glass. They're kind of clouded inside your lungs. And that's where the COVID virus is doing its attack. Some people get ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome. And these are the ones, the small percentage, who require a ventilator. Fluid collects in the lungs, you can get less oxygen. So when we're talking the most extreme responses, the deadly or potentially deadly responses to the novel coronavirus, to COVID, what's happening is fluid gets into your lungs, therefore you get less oxygen. So your body can't carry the oxygen to the rest of the body. And this can cause ultimately kidney, liver, and lung shutdown, which is why you need a respirator to artificially be pushing oxygen into your body. Now let's look at the health aspects of this. Now that we've looked at the perspective from the virus, let's look at the perspective from the human. We will spend some time in class looking at the Global Health Security Index and how prepared are our countries, including especially Morocco. How do you know if you have it? First off, symptoms. We break the symptoms down into three clusters, and people tend to get one of these three clusters. There's the respiratory cluster, which includes fever and cough. If you're coughing a lot for over an hour or 3 or more episodes per day, that's a good sign that you've got COVID. Not guaranteed, but it's a good sign. And breathing difficulties. So the respiratory cluster of symptoms are fever, cough, and breathing difficulties. The second cluster is the musculoskeletal cluster. Other people tend to get these symptoms: muscle and joint pain, headache, and fatigue. The third cluster is the digestive system cluster: diarrhea, vomiting, and abdominal pain. The American Journal of Gastroenterology suggested from March 2020 in a study they did that digestive symptoms are some of the first signs of COVID. Also, symptoms that don't belong to any of these particular clusters but are fairly common with COVID are a loss of smell and taste. Your senses of smell and taste are linked together, so this makes sense. I want to stress that if you don't have a loss of sense of smell and taste, that is not a clear sign that you don't have COVID, but it is a clear sign that you do. What I mean is, loss of smell and taste are not found in many other viral diseases. So if you've got that, that is a clear warning sign. But if you have no loss of sense and smell and taste, that's only about maybe 1/5 of COVID cases, COVID-19 cases. So plenty of people get COVID without having the loss of smell and taste. And just to allay your concerns, when you've got a clogged up nose from a cold, you don't smell things, and if you don't smell things, you don't taste things as much. So if your nose is actually clogged up, that probably means you have a cold, and also that you won't smell and taste as much. And we've all experienced that before. Other symptoms that don't link with any of the three clusters are nasal congestion and runny nose. So there's the cold, but usually when you have a cold, you're also sneezing, which is not a sign of COVID-19. A sore throat doesn't fit these other three clusters. That's another sign of COVID. Basically, symptoms vary. The Wild Cards is a wonderful multi-author science fiction slash fantasy slash superhero book series that was started by George R.R. Martin, who wrote the Song of Ice and Fire, which became Game of Thrones. In it, an alien virus is released into the world that kills horribly 90% of humans immediately. Those that come in contact with the virus, about 9% of them will live but be horribly disfigured. They're called jokers. 0.9% will get a really lame superpower like being able to levitate a penny. And 0.01% will become superheroes. I bring this up not only to recommend the wonderful series, but also to say it has some similarities to COVID-19. No, it doesn't come from aliens. But it does have some similarities in that it affects everyone in different ways. Wild Cards even more so because it's fantasy, but for us humans with COVID-19, different people get different kinds of symptoms. So let's look at the prevalence. Again, I don't expect you to memorize these percentages, but I want you to know what are the more common and what are the less common symptoms. Fatigue affects people 68.3% of the time. This loss of smell and taste is 64.4% of people who get it. I said a moment ago it was a quarter. That was incorrect. I'm correcting myself. It's 64.4% of people who get COVID have a loss of smell and taste. Again, that is a clear sign that you've got COVID, but lack of that is not a sign that you do not have it. A dry cough is 60.4%, a fever 55.5%, muscle pain 44.6%, shortness of breath 44.1%, headache 42.6%, a sore throat 31.2%. So, most common symptoms are fatigue, least common symptoms are sore throat. You can get fatigue, you can have no fatigue and still have COVID. In children, the symptom prevalence is different. And by children, for the rest of this time, I mean you, everyone who's too young to get the vaccine. So, some of you. If you are 15 or younger, you're a child. I don't mean that to be insulting, but for epidemiology purposes, you are considered a child. In children, 56% get a fever, 54% get a dry cough, and 13% get shortness of breath. We all know that children are less affected by COVID, and they have less extreme cases. However, when you do get extreme cases for children, there is something else that adults don't get, which we don't quite understand. It's called MIS-C, MIS-C, all caps, standing for Multisystem Inflammatory Syndrome in children. And it's a serious condition where different body parts can become inflamed, including not just inflamed tissue of the hands, but the heart, lungs, kidney, brain, skin, eyes, and gastrointestinal organs. This is very dangerous. It's very rare. In the US, which has had millions and millions of cases, only 1,700 cases have been reported of MIS-C, resulting in 26 deaths of children. But it does happen. Further cause that even though it's rare, it is important, even though you're still epidemiologically considered a child, to mask up and to do social distancing. What are early signs that you have a tough case? Not that you'll have COVID, but an early warning sign that you will have a more extreme case of COVID. Shortness of breath, a really bad headache, abdominal pain, and severe fatigue. Not for nothing, but those are symptoms of many other illnesses and diseases as well. So, if you, just because you have those things does not mean that you're going to get severe COVID. It's a warning sign that if you do have COVID, you are more likely to have a severe case of it. How do you know that you don't have COVID? I mentioned this before. Sneezing is not a symptom. Although you can have COVID and a normal cold at the same time, which would be a bummer. Allergies are chronic. You have them all the time. They go for weeks and months or even years. Allergies do not produce fevers or body aches. They improve with antihistamines. And itchy eyes. That's an allergy. That's not COVID. So if it's going on for a long time, if it's something with itchy eyes, if you get better with antihistamines, if you don't have a fever and body ache, that's an allergy. That's not COVID. Allergies also give you red eyes, and red eyes are one of the symptoms of COVID as well. Not as common, but they can be. The COVID, as I said, is more closely related to the cold than it is to the flu in evolutionary terms, but it causes symptoms that are more similar to the flu. The cold is a coronavirus. Not all coronaviruses are deadly. But you can't really tell the difference between a flu and coronavirus without testing. Therefore, get your flu shot. The flu shot won't cure COVID, but it has a 66% chance of keeping you from getting the flu, which means you don't rush to the hospital and overwhelm the already overwhelmed hospital with flu cases. So get your flu shot this year if you haven't already done so. It will protect you from influenza, not from COVID, but it will keep you from worrying that you got COVID when all you got was the flu, which has almost the same symptoms, but is not as deadly. The severity, 81% of people who get COVID will have a mild to moderate case, including asymptomatic cases. 14% will have a severe case of COVID-19, and 5% will be critical. That means possibly deadly. Hospitalization, if you have a COVID case that is critical, is usually needed after 7 days. 1/3 of those who get COVID, that is in the mild to moderate group, will be asymptomatic, no symptoms. You'll have COVID and you won't even know it, which means you are still contagious, which is again why we mask. We mask for others, not ourselves. Especially since people who aren't symptomatic, who have no symptoms, are usually not going to be tested. So it's more possible for them to spread it. We still need to social distance, even after getting the vaccine. In the time from infection to first symptoms, it's usually 4 to 5 days median, and for most people, between 2 to 7 days. The median average is 4 to 5 days. Most people, it's between 2 to 7 days from infection to the first symptoms. And most experience at least one symptom within 12 days. There is also out there long COVID. Long COVID is a bad case that is months of recovery and includes permanent damage to organs, which we're still beginning to learn about. This is similar to people who had permanent damage from other diseases in the past, like paralysis, or having to be in an iron lung for the rest of their lives because of polio virus, which we now have a vaccine for. So there are some people who get permanent damage from this, even though they recover. How do you care for COVID? First, what do you do for caring for yourself and for others? Self-isolate even at the home, in the home. If you are at home, it doesn't mean that everyone else is going to get COVID. You stay in your room separate from everyone else if it's determined that you have COVID. Stay indoors. Do not go outside except for going to the hospital. Get plenty of rest. Your body is trying to fight this disease and it needs to recover. Hydration. The same as what you do for a cold and flu. Drink plenty of fluids, especially juice with low sugar and water. Use cold and flu medication for the symptoms. It won't cure you, but it'll help make your symptoms less. Wear a mask when you're around anyone else in the house. You don't want your family to get this, especially the more vulnerable older members of the family. Wash your hands regularly with soap for 20 seconds after coughing or sneezing. Do not touch the mouth, the nose, and the eyes. Use separate dishware from everyone else in the house, and clean the surfaces that you use regularly, or have someone else do it. For more severe cases, because of triage, and we don't want to overcrowd the hospitals that are already overwhelmed, go to the hospital. Go to the hospital when you have trouble breathing, constant pain or pressure in the chest, when you or the person with COVID is confused, when you're unable to wake them up, and if there's blue lips or blue face. The latter is especially important with children, very young infants, where they can't communicate to you what's going on. Those are bad signs. Even if it's not COVID, blue lips and blue face mean there's a lack of oxygen and you need to rush that child to the hospital. In the future, this week, we will look at how to live in this time of COVID and the evolution of the virus. Very intriguing what's going on with it. How is it formed and where is it likely to go? I look forward to discussing this further with you tomorrow.